To get started, I'm Kim, a researcher at the Center for Transdisciplinary Research on Culture, Space and Memory at the University of Porto in Portugal. And Susa here is my co-organizer and co-moderator today. And she is actually a researching practitioner working simultaneously at the Department of Built Environment at Aalto University in Finland and at the city of Helsinki in Finland. And actually has, I think, more than myself, experience in planning practice, which will be exciting here as well. This roundtable has been inspired by the PhD studies of the both of us, which had some relation to the topic of social learning, and of course had some basis also in the ASOP conference, the yearly planners conference in Europe, but I think also beyond by now. We realized during our studies that social learning, which we define tentatively, we will come back to that, as learning in and from the process of joint work and decision making. So it's a very basic sense, is actually both a very elusive but also crucial concept in planning. And we realized what we're constantly interacting as planners with different people, with various people, and what actually happens there? What do we take away from that interaction? And we did actually start to wonder what does this learning lead to when we do come together, and depending on who we come together with. Is that learning somehow predictable, and can or should we actually influence that learning? Is it too complex to really say anything about it, or can we dive in and just discuss it? What can we say about it? Whose views can be included? And is it actually that the status quo of social learning is desirable or not? So with these and other questions, we approached the speakers that we invited here today and asked them to help us explore some possible answers here with us today. And that's just a start, because this is obviously a huge mountain of questions. But before we get to the questions to the speakers here, I'm going to share my screen to show you a Mentimeter slide, two questions that we would like to ask the audience and the speakers to fill in. So just one moment, where we would like to find out basically what your background is, where you are coming from. Just one moment, I'm having an issue here. Okay, this is great. So we'd like to know what your profession is, or in what area you work or study if you're a student. If you could go to Mentimeter or menti.com and use the code 31006742, which is indicated here at the top of the page, and just write down a couple of answers, your own answers. That would be wonderful. We'll see here what pops up. Interesting. I think we had already more than 20 people in before. We have a lot of planning academics, it seems. Thank you for answering, everyone. Okay. Quite a bit of diversity here, so that's really interesting to see. Quite a bit of planning, which makes sense. Of course, we did circulate this in our own circles of research and practice. But this is really interesting to see. I'm currently working at a transdisciplinary research center, and it's been quite interesting to see, you know, to work from this background, the background of most people here, with people from a history background, for example, or that kind of area, which is quite different in its approach. So I think we're seeing here planning academics, researchers, planning practice as being most dominant, sociology a bit here, a teacher. I think this is, of course, also always a bit of a question of self-identification, which is also always interesting. Susa and I had been debating that, in fact, if we didn't get any responses from you, that would also be an interesting finding in terms of social learning through these kinds of, you know, online venues. This online social learning and online interaction can also perhaps be something we can get back to if we have time. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I think we had a little over 20 participants at the time that we started. I'm going to move to the next question. Thanks a lot for filling this in. I think we get a bit of a feel for who is here with us. Now, let me see how I can do the next question. So here, we would like to know how familiar you are with the topic of social learning. And we basically give a few options. Never heard about it, you've informally heard about it, you've encountered it, but nothing special really. You know the concept well, or you actually work on that topic in particular. I'd be very curious to know that, also to see if we should adjust the way we discuss the topic based on that. Interesting. I like that we have someone that never heard about it before. Encountered it. Okay, I think we've paused around here. So pretty nice. We have 5 people working on the topic, 2 people that never heard about it, but I think we have a really nice kind of variation or curve here in which most people have encountered it but don't necessarily find themselves experts on the topic. So really interesting to see. Thanks a lot for filling that in. Now I need to close this. So thanks again. Let me now stop sharing and get back to our slide together. So thanks for that. And now we basically are just about to introduce our speakers in a bit more detail. Just wanted to say that we will also have at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end for discussion with the audience. So we're looking forward to that. But first, we're going to turn to the discussion with the speakers. And during the dialogue, during the entire session, you're also welcome to post questions in the chat if you like, and we'll introduce them during the Q&A. That's that, and I turn over to Susa.
Yes, thank you, and welcome also from my part. And today we have here 5 experts discussing the theme of social learning with us. And first, let's welcome Patsy Healey. Patsy is an emeritus professor at Newcastle University, UK, and she has both advocated for and also critically discussed and engaged with collaborative planning throughout her career, and emphasized also the importance of knowledge sharing and the valuing of various types of knowledge in planning processes. So thank you for being here with us today, Patsy. And second, let's also welcome Raine Mäntysalo. Raine is a professor at the Department of Built Environment at Aalto University, Finland, and he has specialized in and published much on communicative planning and also planning theory. And in his work, Raine is especially emphasizing the need to better understand the important concepts of strategy making and trading zones and also power in spatial planning practice. So thank you as well for being here today with us, Raine.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce as well. So thank you both already for being here. And also I'd like to introduce Wendy Tan, who is Associate Professor at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences and Senior Researcher at Wageningen University, so both in Norway and in the Netherlands. She's an expert in inclusive accessibility and mobility planning, in particular, navigating the worlds of academia, planning, practice, and teaching in a really engaging way. She was my my supervisor for my PhD as well, and it was we did a lot of social learning with each other, I think, and really always very inspiring. And António Ferreira as well here is principal researcher at CEST, the Research Center for Territories, Transports and Environment at the University of Porto in Portugal. He's deeply concerned with environmental, social and economic crises the world is currently facing, as I think all of us are, and in particular what that crisis means for children and future generations. His research interests cover a variety of themes, namely urban and transport policy, worldview diversity, worldview theory, emotions in planning and planning education. Thanks for joining as well, both of you. And
yes, and finally, let's welcome Jonathan Metzger. Jonathan is a professor at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, and his research is founded on a diversity of themes that shape the processes and also the substance of planning. And his specific interests so far have been in the themes that shape the processes of planning, and also he has a very strong empirical focus and, for example, discusses the ideas on how the ideas develop during planning processes among the diverse actors. And in an ongoing project, Jonathan has also dived even more deeply into the very relevant questions of who actually shape the city of the future, and also analyzing the collaborative settings of the diverse expertises in urban development processes. So thank you for joining today as well, Jonathan.
so thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And we'll dive right in with the question of from your own background. And I suppose we'll just start from what I see in my screen, and then we'll go around otherwise later on. So Patsy, beginning with you, if you don't mind, how would you define social learning from your own background?
I think for me, I don't think I have ever defined social learning, because I've never thought of it as a concept. I've thought of it as something that happened. I think I'm quite old now, and what's very clear to me as I reflect on a quite broad range of things is how much different phases of our lives, particularly the early phases, and I'm very interested what António thinks about this, how those early phases shape a lot of what we learn about the habits of life, how we come to value things. So I think there's some really interesting things about what one might call formative experiences. I mean, subsequently, I've become a practitioner and then an academic. And I think what but I also, when I was at university, I studied geography and anthropology. I think that social anthropology was for me very useful. I also did an education. I was a teacher for a while, and that was also very useful because you began to think about the social context. So for me, if it's anything that as I think about what you're interested in, I think it's the significance of the social context of family, of school, of university, of what you then encounter, all the different social contexts, how that tend to filter through into what you understand and what you think is important. So I think that's where I've sort of got to thinking about it. I guess in my own work, I suppose in the 1960s, when I was first coming across the planning idea, it was really conducted in an extremely abstracted way, abstracted from the personal experience into some kind of intellectual ether, which was sort of taken out of one's head and put into a box. So you didn't think about it like that. That's in effect what was, I once thought about it as in terms of like frozen spinach, you know, it's taken out, processed and stuck up like that. So I think what I was then trying to do was to kind of unscramble that. And it took me a number of decades before I got there to say, oh, right, we really have to look at to go back to that social anthropology and look at all these social contexts and what we have, what we acquire through being embedded in these social contexts, how they shape us, both in the way we absorb them and follow them, and the way we resist them and critique them and want to break them and do something different. So I don't know if I've grasped what you're all interested in, but that's what your sort of starting point made me think about.
Wonderful, thank you. I was not, yeah, that sounds, I think that's really a wonderful starting point to use here. I saw Jonathan nodding and you're next here, so I don't know if you'd like to react.
No, I think, I mean, Patsy's always so wise. I mean, I just nod. It's just unconscious when she speaks. My own interest in the issues, I think, comes from my engagement when I was a PhD student. I did a lot of reading of classical pragmatist philosophers. And to some extent, John Dewey, who's very, I think, central to social learning theory, but a lot of William James also. And I mean, William James was very inspired by sort of early evolutionary thought and a sort of evolutionary learning theory, where learning is more understood to be a constant adjustment of behavior according to experience, in response to experience. And I think that's where my understanding of social learning comes from, that this is a sort of ubiquitous process of life, that life adjusts. But I think a question that interests me is also the question of then reflecting on this learning. So if this learning is ubiquitous, we learn all the time from the experiences we encounter through our behavior. What lessons do we learn from our learning? How do we reflect upon what we learn? How do we reflect upon how we have adjusted our experience, and if that is helpful or not, or helpful, from what perspective and what purpose? And I think that has led me also to an interest in, which I'm not sure it should be equated with social learning then, but maybe more kind of systemic or organizational learning. And I have a project called TransLearn about ecosystems of learning in sustainable urban development. I saw some colleagues here, Jonas Bylund, Amanda Winter, Raine is also on the advisory board. And there because I think that project comes from, personally, for me, I mean, we all have our different entry point, but a bit of a worry that we place too much faith in learning, in figuring out sustainable urban development, that we put perhaps a little bit too much faith in social learning, to put it that way, automatic learning, in solving these enormous sustainability challenges. So there I'm starting to spoil onwards conversations, but so I'll just drop off there and let someone else continue, I think.
Sounds great, really. Thank you for that. I think we will indeed come back to some of those issues. I'd give the word to António now. Here.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll start with a story, which is this one. I was living in Leeds in UK at a certain stage of my life. I was working at the University of Leeds, and for a number of reasons, I bought a car. It was actually a van. I bought a white van at the time, and I was living with other people at the time. And Natalie, a friend, asked me if I could help her bring some things from our previous house to the house where we were living, house sharing. I said, of course. And so I took her in the car and we went there. It was night. And while I was driving, she became quite dreamy. And she said to me, it's interesting how she was a German person living in UK and working as well in University of Leeds. And she said, it's interesting that as soon as you sit in a car and drive or feel, the landscape moving about, you suddenly feel that you belong. And I found that fascinating because I was starting to learn how to drive on the other side of the road. And I was not feeling that I was belonging at all in that scene. I just bought a car, right? And she, however, was having a very positive feeling, a melancholic feeling of belonging because she was in a car. And I asked her why she was feeling that. And she said, oh, because when I was a kid, my parents used to drive a lot. I used to be a lot on the back seat, and I have very good memories of that time. And I think that is being triggered by this experience because I'm not in a car for a long time. And I think that social learning has a lot to do about these things. And I think that is then important to unpack what social and learning mean, and going into the learning part and going to very classical texts on what learning is or the dimensions of learning. You find things there like associations of ideas and of stimuli and responses, intellectual skills, cognitive strategies, information, attitudes. And so all these can be learned. And in this case, I think she was talking about the kind of learning she did, which is about the stimuli, being in a car, and the response, which was feeling well. And so that is all learning that then we do socially. And here, in an attempt to construct a definition, I would say then that there is a danger in the word social, because I think that planning in particular is very prone to develop and get attached to normative concepts. And I mean normative as we tend to have this tendency to use concepts and develop concepts that typically are a combination of two words, one of them being an adjective, for example, social learning or social innovation, smart cities, this kind of thing. And what happens is that we tend to give a normatively positive meaning to the term. That is, it is assumed that the reasons why people make it happen are supposed to be good, positive, constructive, and that the outcomes of the process are supposed to be good. And so social here sometimes is interpreted as something that is civic and not something that happens because people are around. And that is, I think, dangerous because we then start to operate in the semantic field full of very normative and moralistic concepts, which make it very difficult to, and I hate the word, but I'm going to use it, to think about it scientifically, meaning accepting that social learning can be good or bad and can be done, therefore, because of good and bad reasons and can lead to good or bad results. And so I think I'll stop there with these.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting addition here as well, to be aware of where something is being normatively engaged as well. Wendy, you would be next. What do you think?
Well, I hear a lot. It resonates a lot with me what Patsy, Jonathan, of course, António have said so far. So I have a really patchy career background, let's put it that way. So before I was an architect working in Asia, mostly, I was actually working with children with learning disabilities. So from that point onwards, I was always quite fascinated how people learn and why they learn the things they do, and how do they actually learn or choose things to learn from while they sort of ignore certain things. And that translated very much into a curiosity tempered by some frustration when I was switching from becoming a planning practitioner in the Netherlands to become a planning academic. And I was doing a PhD research with, I think, 2 different regional authorities, the National Train Company. And we were looking at international examples of transit-oriented development. And kept getting pushbacks from my practitioners saying that, yeah, you know, it's great that you have all this experience internationally, but we're very clear that we don't want to learn from the profitable cases in Asia. And no one could explain to me in a clear way why they didn't want to do that. So that started my fascination with why do you sometimes also choose things that you don't want to learn from, and how do you turn away from that, and how that actually trickles through from the organizational level to the individual, and from the individual to the organization at times. So that, let's say, the organizational norms at that point. And I had a really wonderful chance to write a research project, which Kim and I worked on for a few years, where we wanted to explore this sort of almost, I would say, normative rhetoric that was happening in the Netherlands at that time, in line with devolution of government responsibilities, where planners were taught to say that, okay, actually, we don't really need to do the things that we do. We just need to ensure that communities come together, do their citizen initiatives. And as long as they're together, and this was actually a literal quote from the policy, as long as they're together, social learning will occur, and hence the community initiative will be successful. And I had big problems with that statement, which led me to work with Kim to explore, you know, is that really true? And if it is, or if it isn't, what are the impacts or the effects of this social learning relationships that we can identify, or maybe not even identify, and trying to just give a critical but systematic view across 14 different cases here in the Netherlands in comparison to 18 different cases that we were following overseas. So I have a what reserved understanding over the positive impacts of social learning. You could say that, if I look at it from a planning perspective.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, and thanks for sharing some of those insights we looked into together. Yeah, Raine, now we're interested in your thoughts as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, social learning has not really been an academic concept for me. I've come across to that concept, for example, in John Friedman's mapping of historical trajectories in planning thought in his Planning in the Public Domain book, where one of the 4 main trajectories was this social learning / pragmatist tradition, as Jonathan mentioned, that is very much closely connected to pragmatism. I kind of associate, yes, I'm part of that trajectory, at least to a degree, but if we think that social learning is learning taking place in social interaction, I just wonder what is not social learning then, especially in the planning context. I think that all learning necessarily happens in social interaction, and that kind of becomes very, as a concept, very similar to the general concept of learning as such. And I have been working more on the concept of organizational learning in planning, or even learning between organizations in planning. So social learning as such is not kind of a key concept for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see how there's a diverse kind of reaction to seeing social learning as a process that anyway, you know, happens, or as a concept that we're really analyzing. And I think there's also a big clash between, you know, the ways of conceiving of social learning in relation to, you know, how planning practice interprets it as a concept sometimes in some contexts, like also Wendy looked at, and I think also Jonathan's work might come more into that again as well. But I think at the same time, there is also something to be said to look at social learning as a kind of more analytical, perhaps, idea that's not so applied in a way. So I think there are here things to think about. António seems to have a last point, and then I think Susa will take over after that for another area of question that I think follows nicely. António?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in response to this idea what learning isn't social, that, for example, if a person gets a ball in a tennis racket, and starts to throw the ball against a wall, that learning of the mechanical aspects of this isn't social. The person is on their own, etc. And I think the difficulty of people in the planning field to think about learning that isn't social is because planning has become an utterly disembodied professional activity in which the experience of walking in the city, for example, doesn't count anymore. For example, consider yourself walking on your own at night to assess the extent to which you understand the streets like network, and you appreciate aspects of the city by means of your own embodied engagement with the city. In a number of ways, this would be a social experience, would be an embodied experience of the city. And it's interesting that planners in the professional imagination of planning and planning practice, planning research, this is very marginal. And I think that is a killer thing. And I think the root of this is probably that moment in which evidence-based planning, evidence-based practice, evidence-based stuff started to become quite important, in the sense that then what is most important is to compile a number of data that is reported on a piece of paper, and that is considered material, professional material. And with that, therefore, possibility of talking about non-social learning in planning becomes difficult. As well, I would ask, and then there are borderline issues. For example, to what extent, when we are engaging in platform urbanism, are we doing social learning, in the sense that our understanding of others happens through digital platforms? In this case, I think it's social learning. But when what is the machine that is acquiring information about the city, about the social dimension of the city, is that social learning what is being done at the level of planning? I think that is a more gray area, but I will just leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, António, and others for the good comments. Let's first hear Patsy before going to our next theme.
Well, I was just thinking, it was very interesting listening to you, António, because you're talking about evidence-based, all these kind of little concepts that have floated into the ether of planning practice discussions. People write papers about them, but they're very recent. 30 years ago, we weren't using them. So there's a very interesting question. Where have they come from to flow into practice in this way? And is that something about the learning processes? And I think that takes me to something else. I think I am very sympathetic to Wendy, actually. But one thing I don't know, you were talking about kind of organizational context and these things. And I found it really helpful to look at the work of Wenger. What's his first name? By the way, you should talk about forgetting as well as learning. This is really important. I've forgotten that John Friedman calls his chapter social learning. I've completely forgotten. But I was kind of thinking this notion of communities of practice, which again is exploding and being used quite broadly, but in the meaning it was about a group of people in an office and the practices that they've worked out among themselves and how they then interacted with others to defend themselves from too much pressure. And I think when we start to, we can upscale that to a professional group. What is it that makes people feel our professional group thinks like this? And they meet another professional group which thinks like that. And I've got a really good story if we come on to kind of ecosystems, because I think it's the communities of practice within ecosystems of relationships, which might be kind of getting us some idea of why it is that some ideas flow in, why some ideas are rejected, if you see what I mean. Anyway, that was just a kind of thought. I thought we should put communities of practice in there.
Thank you, Patsy. Very interesting views and also quite well related to our next theme. So next we would like to turn our attention on the actual actors in these learning processes and ask that when we consider the views on social learning, what do you think, whose learning do we actually include in the processes? So here I would like to first give the floor to Wendy. You mentioned already earlier examples of whose learning might not be included in the processes. So would you like to open the discussion on the question on whose learning do we then include?
Very happy to, Susa. So let's go back to the example where I had to work with this really large community of practitioners in the Netherlands who are interested in furthering transit-oriented development. Not saying that they haven't done it, but there was a very clear group who said this is what we need to do in the next 20 years. And what I figure out after a while is that depending on the cities that they come from, so depending also on the political color of the, let's say, the policymakers that they do report to, there are certain cities that are considered good practices, best practices, cities that they align themselves against, they line themselves up to. They keep using the word benchmarking, for example. They use the word best practices quite a bit. They always talk about what are the lessons learned here that we can get from them versus everything else. And there was a weird sort of break also in their learning and their understanding, because on one hand, so let's take, for example, the city of Amsterdam or the region of Amsterdam, which was also one of our partners at that point. They kept saying, Amsterdam is comparable to Paris and New York. So if you have any examples from there, those are the ones that we would like to hear from. Now, if you just Google the size of Paris and New York and Amsterdam, structurally, in terms of demography, it's not the same thing. But what is happening here is that they have certain aspirations. And that's what they actually pile their sort of aspirational learning towards when trying to learn from something. And what we also figure out after a while is it actually did not matter what lesson was being said or taught to these practitioners when they asked for best practices, as long as you can couch it as, yes, this is something that's quite innovative that Paris has been doing, it lands. Even though the context might not be something that would work for them, or even if the lesson is not directly relevant to them. Another incident that I had was when I was visiting Copenhagen. I had the pleasure to meet with I would say, the man who has been sort of expanding the Copenhagen Finger Plan for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And he had a very interesting look on how transit-oriented development went, because he just said that basically anything that the Netherlands does, this is something that I learned to use for Copenhagen. So, there's also this sort of mutual aspirational relationships happening. But what he does also say is that, well, at the end of the day, sure, as long as it is from someone I trust and they tell me that this is a good example for me to follow, then I will believe it and I will use it. And we see that coming back a lot in literature, right? So from whom does this knowledge flow from? What is the level of trust in terms of recognition of expertise, but also in terms of recognition of being a peer? Then that learning occurs. And I think that this is something we don't talk quite a bit about when we're looking at social learning in planning. And we see that coming back in some of our projects, which we can go into in a bit more detail. But I'm also curious if other speakers have had similar sort of encounters with planning practitioners or policymakers with very, very definite views on what they can or cannot learn from.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Very important questions. Jonathan seems to have something on his mind.
Yeah, I think the question who learns is critical, but I think I would like to add a qualifier and ask also who learns what. For instance, in TransLearn, we partially take an interest in many countries have funding programs like a research and innovation programs. Often you want to combine triple, quadruple helix, different kinds of actors to develop sustainable urban development methods, technology. So you have these, it might be a national innovation agency or something, and they give up money. You can apply, come up with something smart, an experiment, urban experiment or a test bed. And what's interesting, I think, is that often in these, there's a very implicit, actually, evolutionary evolutionary theory of learning behind these programs that are often, I think, and this is still just a hypothesis on my side, not very well developed, how the thoughts about, you know, what the theory of learning is behind there. Because I think that this implicit evolutionary theory of learning is that, you know, we're going to fund a whole bunch of projects, and then with time it's going to show which were the good ones, and those are kind of automatically going to somehow propagate in this landscape and, you know, become these good practice examples. But I'm not sure that, and here comes the question if social learning is enough, for instance, because I'm not sure that this is going to happen by itself in a very, you know, fortuitous way. I'm not sure that, you know, maybe it needs to be more structured than that, the learning among the funders and among the government, who is kind of funding the funders often. So I think there's a lot of learning going on often in these projects on a personal level and on this community of practice level, and what works and what doesn't, often from a very practical point of view. You know, how can we make this project come together and not become a disaster? Or what can we do differently to have a more, you know, well-functioning project locally next time? But I'm not so sure that the learning is working as well on those higher levels, you know, the people funding and this. I'm putting somewhat in doubt this automatic propagation, but that's up to, I hope, partially our project and other projects to find out to what extent that is happening and how well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Raine, what kind of ideas did this conversation bring to your mind?
Yeah, whose learning do we include in our concept of social learning? I believe that was the question. I need a bit of clarification. Are we talking about the us as academics perceiving social learning in planning, or are we talking about how we perceive that actually happens in practice? Who is included there as sources from whom to learn? Well, how do you see it, Susa? Which ones are we talking about?
You can, of course, share your insights on both of the questions, but maybe we can start from them, your insights in the planning practice field. So what do you see whose learning is currently involved in or included in planning practice?
Yeah, I would like to connect learning to a challenge or problem that you are dealing with, and then there are usually certain usual suspects from which you think that the relevant knowledge, evidence, or views can be gathered to in trying to solve the problem, and you gather certain people that are more legitimate in handling this and others that are irrelevant, and I'm interested in certain biases related to this gathering of usual suspects of knowledge sources when the problems tend to get more wicked than we assume, and then how to deal with that learning challenge, that we are not dealing with a certain type of problem that we have been used to deal in the past, or that we systematically ignore certain groups of people and do unjust planning through this routine of involving certain groups and not involving others, and what kind of learning is required to transgress this habit of kind of ill-formed problems in planning. What kind of learning do we need to kind of unlearn from our usual way of seeing planning problems in order to have more just planning practice, or more capable planning more capable planning practice to deal with the actual wickedness of problems, where we need the cross boundaries and include different epistemic cultures and different types of knowledge to deal with that kind of a wicked boundary crossing problem.
Thank you, especially the boundary crossing here and how we tend to still be quite siloed also in our own thinking and learning were very important here. Patsy, what do you think about the theme of whose learning do we actually include in the processes?
Well, I got really stuck on the concept, who is this we we're talking about? But I think from what you're saying, we're talking about people, planning practitioners or professional practitioners or planning academics. So, well, maybe, but we use the word we so frequently without thinking about the community to which we are relating ourselves. And I think that is something we should learn to be much more careful about. But I think I'll like António, I'll tell a story. About 20 or 30 years ago, it's in the 90s, and we were just thinking about the different ways in which one might sort of improve or relate to people in different neighborhoods in the city of Newcastle. And I was talking with some people from our health service, and we began to think about the different professions. And so the health people were saying, well, you've got to think holistically. So I said, okay, that's interesting. Could you tell me, when you think holistically, what do you mean? And what they meant was they had to look at the whole system centered, so this is interesting, the whole system. So it was a system of relations centered on the human body and the human person. So I said, well, that's very interesting, because in the planning field, we might be talking about the urban system and a completely different way of sets of relations. So we began to think, so we began to open this up, and we said, well, let's imagine we're talking to people with an education background in our country, this might be. Well, I wonder how they think. We got to this idea, there are different meanings of holism, depending on what kind of practice and what kind of problem challenges you were faced with. Anyway, we both of us immediately came to a very quick conclusion that for education people, it was the school. And we'd all of us encountered extreme difficulties in making links with people with the teachers in the schools, because they have a particular way, maybe it's different in other countries, but in our country, very much a particular way in which you go about teaching children. And unless you can incorporate anything from the outside into these programs, you really can't kind of get things worked out. So that made me think, every time I think about I think about we're set in these systems of relations which have their own kind of practices linked to them. I think there's a terrible tendency, and it's not just in planning, but it's in the health service the same, and I imagine it's the same in schools, we've got into a kind of, we've overproduced sort of academic and professionalized knowledge. And then each professional group seems to have got themselves with bits of vocabulary which tell them what they're doing. And they've stopped asking them, what are the assumptions that are hidden behind this vocabulary, this rhetoric, these routines that they're doing? What theory of change have they got? That if they do X, Y might follow. And it's where I think we really have to really unscramble that and say, it's not just the bits and pieces of all this rhetorics that get, or these good practices or whatever people start looking at, but what do people think they're trying to do? And what do people, and what difference do they think they're going to make? And where are these kind of assumptions? We've lost track of the assumptions which shape a lot of these practices. And because I've been working a lot in my community just as an ordinary resident, talking around with all kinds of people, and they come across all these bits of kind of professional rhetoric. And it just strikes me how often a professional is quite unable to explain to a citizen who's just asking an ordinary question like, who do you mean by we? Or learning, are we at school or something? What are you talking about? And we've got so over-professionalized, we've lost track of translating into ordinary language what people are actually, how we might talk to people, or exchange thoughts between people. So I think this issue of the crossing boundaries between communicative groups is really important. No, these systems of communication is really important. And we exclude all professional groups, that we of professional groups continuously exclude lots of people or fail to understand lots of people because they fail to see the nature of their the vocabulary that they're using is actually creating a barrier.
Yes, indeed. Your comments also created some reactions in the audience. You were sent some hearts from the audience a moment ago. So then, António, what do you think of this question and the theme of who are we including?
Well, I probably would refer to the book, Howell Baum's book, the Noldy one, The Invisible Bureaucracy, which is a book from 1987, so it's not so recent. And it's really interesting. Author talks about the psychological contract. And the psychological contract can be defined as a kind of a tacit employment contract that is established among the employees and the employing organization. And it says that this is different from the signed contract, the official explicit contract that people sign when they are employed by a given organization. And so while the signed contract is quite set on stone, and is what is to be read in the paper, the psychological contract is incrementally produced, is negotiated, and in fact, even though it doesn't use exactly the terms, it's produced through a social learning experience inside the working organization. I'm saying this because I feel that at the moment there are some really problematic things are happening in the psychological contracts that are being produced in contemporary planning organizations. And evidence, and I think it's very much a result of this incredible focus on competition that people are increasingly exposed to. And I did some research. Actually, the lead researcher was Kim, was with us here on this topic, in which we were seeing how concept of innovation has been approached, and what we saw in European funded projects. And what we saw through this was that there was a kind of an evolution. By the way, when I say evolution, I don't mean it that it's going from worse to better. Just saying it's changing. It was an evolution towards the abstracts, the summaries of the projects being increasingly self-promotional. While in some years ago, the projects were much more about things like, well, we are going to study the extent to which or whether these, and it was a lot of ifs and hypotheses and possibilities to study. In more recent rounds of funding, what you can check is that projects are more like, this is such a great idea, this is a top idea, this is going to change a lot. And so the presentation of the scientific project is extremely self-promotional and political. And this makes us think about theories of learning at the societal level. What happens to society in which, because of the psychological contracts that are signed inside the organizations, in which people are being asked to, by all means, be as maximum competitive and productive and scoring as much as possible in ranking systems. They are trying to do as much as they can to show that what they say matters and is best and is a top idea and it needs to be funded, etc., etc., etc. This is a kind of a race to a mad race that is happening. And I think this is really worrying, because I would then talk about Mirovsky's amazing book, Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, in which he describes how, at a certain stage, in the 80s, more or less, in the economics curriculums in school, in higher education, it was basically decided that economic history was not supposed to be maintained in the syllabus. It was much more important to focus on theory, on equations, on computation abilities, etc. And that stuff, that fluffy stuff of history was kind of subjective, was irrelevant. And that creates a very interesting we. It's a really interesting we that society, we as a whole, by means of participating in this nonsense, in one way or another, we are creating. And I think the we are creating is an elite we that is increasingly using metrics and competitive mechanisms to exclude an increasingly larger number of we's, which become others, so that a very specific agenda is promoted. And so I'm really concerned with where these European Union funded, highly competitive logics of collective learning at the macro scale societal level is leading us. Because in the end, we are getting increasingly weird psychological contracts inside university organizations, in which people are increasingly worried about precarity and where this is going to lead us in the end, in terms of the kind of knowledge we produce, we accept as knowledge, and the kind of learning we consider endorsable.
Thanks, António. I think this is really kind of bringing us round in a way, again, through really interesting themes. And actually, I think it brings back the question that was raised a bit earlier by Jonathan on the what in relation to the who, right? And I think perhaps, Jonathan, you can come back a bit to that also based on these interventions now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot. I mean, I've been nodding all the time to everyone because I think a lot of very wise things have been said. And I mean, I think a problem, it's a research report. It's not even a published paper by Carol Williams and John Law from a few years back called A State of Unlearning influenced my view on learning a lot. And that was on what they call the market experiment, 30 years experiment in UK government of market reforms, where they said that, you know, the response to seemingly failed experiments were just new similar experiments without really taking a stock of the outcomes. And I think that exactly, you know, what António is referring to, I would love to look at that research more closely, because I think that what we see in a lot of these funding schemes, which are today actually not just in research, you know, fundamentally embedded, but becoming fundamentally embedded also in planning practice, because you're applying for all this, you know, state-of-the-art experimental funding to do special things. And then you have to show you're cutting edge and you're doing an urban living lab, you're doing all these, you know, new technologies testing in the planning process. And I think the problem here is we have planning practitioners that I think are learning all the time to play this game better, like António was referring to, you know, getting more competitive and how to express themselves and how to get their hands on this funding and how to make the project come across as successful. But I think there are too little attention being spent on asking, so what are the outcomes of the game on a societal level of everyone playing this game? You know, how is this affecting a larger context? And I think that can be applied. And I think that, you know, of course, we're not the first to think about this. I think, you know, the reflexive practitioner, Donald Schoen, about the loops of learning, Argyris, they're onto this. The systems theorists are onto this. But I think this is more relevant perhaps today than ever. I mean, speaking of John Friedman, he had a paper with someone called Adjemi, I think, in 1976, asking these exact same questions. You know, how do we learn from experiments, policy experiments? I think that's one of the best papers I've read on learning and planning. But we're still stuck with the same questions. So I hope someone can teach me so I can learn how to get out of that.
Yeah, I think that's what we're here for as well, right? To get a bit of inspiration, perhaps, and to continue that discussion. But indeed, it's notable how the same questions do keep coming up. And I think this isn't the only one that somehow needs to be redigested. And what does that say about learning? Perhaps that we need to, each one of us individually seems to have to go through a whole process, right? Of learning and adopting certain things. I think I'll just go on with Wendy, perhaps if you could share some thoughts. Just a brief intervention. I'm just sharing a few references here for everyone. Feel free to share some references with people in the chat as well, because I think that's really interesting to do here. Go on.
Thank you, Kim, for sharing the Baum reference, one of my favorite writers ever, Baum. We were just discussing him actually yesterday with a group of practitioner. We call them external PhD. So I, aside from my 2 jobs, I'm also research coordinator for the Foundation of Managing Public Space here in the Netherlands. And we have a task to try to, well, this is the word from my board of directors. Our task is to elevate the academic aspects of the discipline of managing public space. What does that mean? That means I have to try to ensure that we have a generation of PhDs who are thinking academically about something that is very almost implementational, operational in its nature, managing, maintaining our public spaces. And this conversation with Jonathan, I mean, I was just nodding my head because yesterday we were just saying exactly the same thing to them, which is, you know, it's great that we can go around and say, oh, we're experimenting here, we're experimenting there, but what is the sort of total sum of this, and what is the cost of society of all this experimentation? On one hand, we gave them the ambition that they have to try to sort of align to or emulate this academic standards that we have for them in order to do their PhD. But there is still value in the work that they are doing from a day to day, and shown, of course, the reflection on that value of work is sometimes, I think, for me in general, for society, much more valuable than trying to pretend that there was some kind of, you know, grand universal theory that was coming out of the things that they were doing. So they are sitting in this sort of 2 ways of, oh, I need to be as theoretical and hypothetical as possible, very grand theories used, you know, in governance or in design, versus trying to just learn from what they have done and trying to sort of collate their decades long of working experience into coming up to, you know, what is the next step for this maintenance management aspects of our discipline. And we don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. We're just starting the discussion. I would love to invite all of you to join the discussion at the next time we have one of these. What António, Kim, I think also Enrica is here today in the room. We had this paper a long time ago. I don't know if António and Kim remembered, where we started also coupling this weird relationship between learning and this strive for innovation in planning narratives. And I think we were all in agreement, that's why we could write that paper together, that it's sometimes actually quite detrimental. So I'm speaking from experience of following some of these living labs experiments that are happening in the Netherlands, that I have ethical concerns with some of them. People's mortgages and houses and lives are on the line in a lot of these experiments, especially our favorite one, which is in Almere, where every summer the sewage overruns, and, you know, because you don't have pipes, you didn't have agreements on how to do your roads, your sewage system, and your waste systems together. But what is also fascinating to me is that what we as planning academics see as this is a failed experiments, we're infringing on people's property values and rights, is actually being touted by planning practice as this is an excellent example of how planning in the Netherlands fulfills innovative experiments. And I can't actually understand why there's sort of this 2 very extreme view to it. So from my understanding from the practitioners that I've spoken to is they are aware that there are issues with these experiments, but because of the competition, as António has mentioned, the sort of need to also strive to show that you have gained credit or you have had good outcomes, they will never be caught saying that it's a problem. So it's always set out as the lesson to learn from for other people. And I'm just a bit worried that, you know, of course, this is an echo chamber thing. It goes from one country to another, and then we'll be hearing only about the good parts of things that actually have failed rather than hearing why things have actually failed. So I'm actually quite lucky this week. I call this a valuable week because on Friday, I'm going to have a workshop with some colleagues here in the Netherlands, trying to understand the value of failures in planning. So trying to sort of restart a conversation to look at how can we learn from failures? How can we have a theoretical methodological framework that is pursuing failures instead of just good results, which most research calls nowadays ask for. They want proven results. They want us to run living labs. They want us to learn policy labs and policy experiments with sort of this assumption that they will all turn out to be well. And unfortunately, from what I've seen, they don't all turn out to be well, but no one dares to speak about it. I think that, you know, let's go back to Baum. I think the fear of failure is actually a huge part of this discussion that we need to have.
That's a great point, Wendy. I think really I think some of the work you and I did as well had a relation to this understanding of the individual, and I think António here also has quite a bit of work on that, and trying to see, I think here the social and the individual kind of need to be brought together in an interesting way as well. Raine, could I ask you to react? Do you have any thoughts on those issues, especially the question of, you know, what are we really learning? What are we taking away from these interactive moments? Raine, I don't know if you heard me.
Right, did you ask me?
Yeah, yes, sorry. Might not
Okay,
have
sorry.
spoken loudly.
Yeah, Jonathan mentioned about learning to play the game, and I suppose it is about learning is about learning techniques and technologies understood broadly. It can be learning technology of using digital planning tools, but it can also be learning about the technology of how to take part in participatory planning processes, learning how you are treated as a participant if you enter the forum in the first place. But then the next stage is to learn critically about that, as Jonathan mentioned, that you put that into a broader societal context. You learn to manipulate that technology and behave tactically and strategically in relation to that. And the participant might learn that, okay, these participatory processes that are being arranged, they are just tokenism. I really cannot influence through those forums that are provided for me. So as a participant, as a stakeholder or citizen, I might influence by contacting the councillors, mayor, and other powerful decision makers directly, or start using media and arranging social media campaigns or demonstrations and whatever, because I've learned that these alternative technologies are much more successful for my purposes. And that in a sense represents the kind of third stage of learning, that you learn to develop and utilize different technologies. When you learn that a certain technology that you have initially learned doesn't actually work for your needs and purposes, and through this kind of a criticism, you kind of subject yourself and understand the need to learn other technologies that work better.
Yeah, I think this difference between learning and learning critically is something that kind of unites some of the thoughts I think that we have brought up here, kind of trying to explore that. But I think we'll come back perhaps to a bit of that. Patsy, can I ask you to share some of your insights here? We don't hear you. Sorry, Patsy. The microphone.
Sorry, I've lost track of which is the question. Which is the next bit of question?
We've been talking about, or we're talking about the what we learn question. So when we move from who learns to what we learn, but
okay, it's number 3. Yeah.
Different areas of that theme, I think. But just if you want to share your reaction on what we learn, that would be great.
I'm trying to think about this group of planning practitioners and planning academics. I think there's actually, we should say, within that kind of tradition of thinking, there are some quite useful things or ways of thinking, and that's possibly that we're able now within that tradition people do begin to think about multiple sets of relationships and how they might interact. Now, on top of that, we've got all these routines which are trying to squash things into a different way round. But there is a way of thinking about these broader relationships, these multiple relationships. We also tend to think also about multiple scales. But so if I'm thinking about what we learn, I'm thinking about what we've been discussing so far, and also some work that I did about 10, 12 years ago on the way planning ideas traveled, invented in one place. It's a bit like where Wendy was turning up in another place. What I found, what I think is really interesting about that is that when it comes to another place, instead of saying, oh, we're like this, so we can borrow it and use it, people should say, every situation is unique. Everything, even the making of a decision about a piece of regulation, it's a unique thing. It's a unique challenge, a unique problem with unique dimensions and a unique array of other relationships that are going to be affected, and broader power structures surrounding all these relationships at multiple scales. And I think understanding the uniqueness of everything then should allow us to begin to probe a bit into these multiple relationships, to see what is sometimes people use the word kind of action space back in the 70s. I don't know if that's still what is that little space which is available to be used as we think about this particular problem in this particular space, and we recast the problem. It may be problem X, or it may be actually, it would be better if we cast it into the problem X over Y or something like that. But I think it's getting to understand that uniqueness in all its manifestations. So I begin to see how one might do an education program to help to kind of encourage that. But it would encourage a mind of unscrambling everything and then repositioning to say, I think back to what Raine was saying, what we can actually do in this particular place, where if you're a practitioner, it applies also to academics. Actually, we're speaking now in a particular situation to a particular group of people who are interested in a particular sort of thing. What happens to that in that kind of situation? And I think we're struggling to kind of work out what are the parameters of how we're positioned in this particular discussion. But I think it applies to very, very many practitioners, so that this kind of like something that limits the extent to which you could take an off-the-shelf solution for every unique problem. I think that's been one of the really big difficulties that we face. And it's not just in the planning field, but medical field plays it as well, and different other professionalised groups face that problem too. Just a thought, anyway.
Thanks. I wanted to give the word to António briefly and ask him to keep it a bit short, because we still want to get to the Q&A, and we have one last question we want to go through. But António, do you have any reactions on this?
I would just perhaps say that it worries me that when we look at organizations of the bureaucratic or hierarchical type, they didn't show great capacity to learn due to the weight of the hierarchy. And then we transition towards project-based meritocratic organizations, and they also don't seem to be doing a very good job in learning things that can actually lead us towards the much needed developments in terms of sustainability, justice, etc., etc. And so that shows that we really need to think about organizations very carefully, and about how people are inside organizations constrained not to learn because they are so worried not to learn things that matter, because they are so worried in showing that they learn what their organization values. And I think we really need to quickly get out of that. And so if you want me to be in the short mode, I think that will be my key point.
Thank you. Many existential questions of social learning and its existential challenges, all of them resonate very well with me also as a planning practitioner. But before opening the Q&A session, let's wrap up the discussion by one or two sentences from each of you to the last question of can we say that social learning is in itself desirable, and why or why not? And maybe if Raine, could you open up the wrap up round here?
Yeah, if I continue with the learning, the idea of learning, that it is about learning technologies you are habituating into a certain context and developing routines and perhaps also learning to deal with those in a kind of critical fashion. But if you are not, if these technologies actually do not work well, they are unjust or you don't get where you want to go when dealing with your planning problems with a certain set of technologies, then habituating into this technology and learning these technologies is then kind of detrimental. You are just repeating and bringing forward a certain dysfunctional, very often organizational behavior that you have developed in your planning organization. So this kind of learning is sort of pathological and unfruitful. If you are not able to reach to the critical stage and further into the stage of transgressing these technologies and improving them to better meet the changed circumstances or developing them to more just technologies. Thanks.
Thank you, Raine. Jonathan, in one or two sentences, is social learning desirable?
Well, I think one of the earliest really influential applications of social learning theory was Akers 1973, who wrote in Criminology, The Social Learning of Deviant Behavior. And I think deviating can be very important if the norms, if you don't agree with the norms. In this case, it was about becoming a gang member. So, my short answer is that no, I don't think social learning in itself is desirable. And I think this point has been raised in an important way here today, that I think it's dangerous, which I think it was António said, to have this implicit normativity and assume that, evolutionary learning has this teleology to itself where things automatically get better somehow. But that ignores, we can't even agree on what better is, and we can't even agree on what we is. So I think this critical perspective on social learning and learning overall is really important.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Wendy, what are your thoughts on the question?
Well, I do quite a bit of education, so let me focus on that. I think this applies also to society as a whole, as well as the planning practitioner and the planning education circuits, which is, I think we need to spend a bit more time teaching people how to learn. So being discriminatory in learning, being reflective in what they learn, because whatever we teach them today may not actually apply over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Technology is moving very fast. So can we say then that social learning is in itself desirable or undesirable? I don't think we could ever come out to that, because it depends on the individual. It depends on the context that you learn from. We've seen the very negative outcomes of it this pandemic, when people started learning things which, you can question the veracity of some of these truths that people are purporting. So in a short answer, I would just prefer to focus on the solution, which is let's try to teach people how to learn first, or learn people how to learn in a better way, in a more discriminate way.
Thank you, Wendy. And António, your short wrap up of the desirability of social learning.
Well, I'm first to think about Peter Beatty. Peter Beatty, I was honored to be his PhD student. And he had a question I found amazing, which was basically, why can't the future be more like the past? Why is the future has to be always so different from the past, if you want to put it in another terms? And I think we should follow his line of thinking when he was talking about that, by means of paying much more attention to how things unfolded before. Because if you don't know that, how could we possibly social learn at a microscopic level if our collective memory is as long as the project? And I'll stop there.
Thank you. António, and finally Patsy, is social learning desirable?
When I saw this question, I think I would agree. Social learning is inevitable. You can't not learn in social circumstances. So I think that's the first thing. But I think what a lot of people are being worried about is, and I think I'll put it in a kind of medical sense, some people be seeing what people seem to be learning is kind of like pathological. It's leading to outcomes that somehow or other we think are wrong and bad. And I'm just wondering, who's the we who says they're wrong and bad? And on what grounds is that we actually standing as we criticize it all? I'm sure I'm criticizing it too, but we do need to think about that. Otherwise we become yet more missionaries in this system promoting goodness knows what.
That sounds great, and I think that's a perfect way to wrap up that question. It's also something that I've struggled with exploring a lot. When is it legitimate to say that we know what others should learn, right? But so I would like to just wrap up this part from our side with an announcement of a follow-up article that we hope to be preparing among those of us here pinned, and we will be working on that in the next months, and then we hope to share it on all the media, etc. as well. And now we would like to open up for some questions from the audience. Feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand here. And we'll try. I'm going to unpin the speakers perhaps so that we can see everyone. If there are no questions, I think we have plenty else to discuss, but I want to give a chance to the audience. Nobody? Then perhaps we can continue to just Wendy just read, let's ask everyone else what they have learned. But we have here a question from Karin Winter. Please do take it on the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for this discussion. Jonathan, I was wondering, you were talking about this, if one could have some fate, or if there was too much fate in social learning. And I was just teaching about methods of knowledge and learning in class today. So I was also thinking, we just recently went back to John Law's After Method, and he sort of poses the question about if we have, I will think about this sort of the kind of trust that we have in knowledge, and if knowing is the metaphor that we need, I think if he puts it like that, in connection with learning. So that was sort of what I wanted to have some sort of reaction on.
Yeah, can I respond?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I think this is something we're really struggling with in our research project that I mentioned, and Jonas posted the link to our still barren homepage. But the connection between learning and knowledge, of course, which are interestingly enough in planning theory, two very at different times lively discussions, but pretty disconnected from each other, which is bizarre, to be honest. But to me, I think also, and then you have the chain, knowledge, learning, action, if you want to bring together discussions, which complicates it even more. And I'm going to be very conspiratorial now. I'm in a pretty dismal place right now following the Swedish elections to be, bringing in the personal and how about and how we feel. But, I I think a problem has been partially, if it comes to sustainable development and urban sustainable development, which is my particular interest, that saying we need knowledge and we need better knowledge and we need to learn has been a way of slowing down action also. And I think we've been fooled, and this is, I know I'm risking what Patsy is saying, falling into missionary mode here, but I think this is such a strong feeling for me that I think us academics have partially been fooled by this also. So knowledge isn't always before action. Knowledge is sometimes to distract from action, I think. So I think this is a wicked complex of problems in itself. But yeah, interesting question. I'm not sure I had an answer, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. In the meantime, we also got a brief comment from Emilia Smeds here, who says, speaking of normativity in the sustainability transitions literature, indeed, which influences a lot of current discourse on experimentation and living labs, an experiment is defined as, based on these commonalities, we propose an overarching definition of experimentation for sustainability transitions. An experiment can be conceptualized as an inclusive, practice-based and challenge-led initiative designed to promote system innovation through social learning under conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity. And she provides here the reference, and I think that really does bring in, I think also in the sense of missionary mode, and I think that's something that we really ought to think very well about, is that question of there are things, I do believe there are things that we have, we need to be missionaries about. Perhaps more explicitly than we dare to do in many cases nowadays. And at the same time, I completely agree that I think too often people go into missionary mode out of a sense of righteousness that is not fair, and that we fall into very quickly. So that's and I think to leave that perhaps as a note for people in the audience as well, to what extent do our political developments around the world, explained also by partially this, on one hand, this draw towards a missionary kind of stance without acknowledging it, and at the same time the lack of it in certain areas as well. So I think that's really a bit of an open question to keep thinking about. António, you have another input, please.
Speaking about missionary and missions, I would just like to alert that the European Union's strategy is based on the notions of mission, innovation-led, oriented growth, whatever missions, which shows the extent to which that kind of humility that comes from wisdom, I think. It's not in the, I would say, not particularly democratic logic of thinking about the future that we can see in the highest level of policy making at the moment.
Thanks. I'm going to give the last word to Patsy here, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks. Go ahead, Patsy. Oh, we don't hear you, sorry.
You may have noticed, or you may have read, that I've always been a bit of a missionary. And I'm a missionary for intellectual capability, and I'm a missionary for, I think, probably some kind of humane social democratic settlement as our political settlement. But I think it's also very important to be realistic. I think the one issue that we haven't discussed is about time. There are multiple times, and there's certain times, the times are out of joint. You're talking about your country, Jonathan, well, have a look at mine. And I think it's possible that we're in the middle of a very significant tipping point. We're living a tipping point. It probably takes some number of years, but I think that's something else that we should, learning to know what kind of a time it is. Back in the 60s was a very stable time. There were other things going on, but relatively, And it's, I think, one of the reasons why people revert to their to these formula, to these rhetorics, to these routines, is partly because things are so uncertain. It's very difficult to know what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, what happens if you do things differently. So I think it would be quite that learning is always in time as well as in a particular social context. So I think maybe just to complicate things yet further. So thank you for the discussion, Kim and Susa.
Thank you so much. And yes, we actually did have a question on time that we wanted to get to, and we didn't manage in the time allotted to this discussion. But I hope that we can continue that and to pick that up at another opportunity. Just to wrap up, because I'm sure that there are people that can only be here until now. I'm going to put in the chat for whoever sticks around a couple of references that were either mentioned here during the talk or that have been published by the speakers and by people here involved that might be of interest to everyone. And we look forward to working among the speakers and organizers of the event. We'll be working on an article. You're very welcome to, anyone here in the audience is very welcome to get in touch as well if you're interested in getting that follow-up. You can send Susa or me an email. Perhaps, Susa, you could write down the email addresses in the chat as well. And I think we'll do our best to share this recording as well on YouTube for people to be able to watch again and to reflect and to also comment as you might wish. I think this was a really inspiring discussion. I think we touched on a lot of issues that each of them could, fill a book probably. But I think that shows really really important issues here. We did actually get, and I'm saying we a lot. Well, indeed, we had that discussion on we, and there's someone in the chat now talking about the we. Here, Tijana Dabovic, could a part of this problem lay in the fact that we didn't learn what planning is? So interesting question. I think, people need to warm up to the questions, and we're out of time, but I think that we should, we'll try to create a platform and a way to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.